The Last Mission Part 1. A Man Without Orders. The morning came in slow and gray, the way winter mornings do in Montana when the sky can't quite decide whether to storm or simply brood. Frost had crept across the highway overnight, laying itself down in thin silver sheets that caught the early light and threw it back in pieces. The pines along the roadside stood perfectly still. No wind, no birds, just the cold and the silence, and the winding empty ribbon of Highway 12 stretching out in both directions like a question nobody had answered yet. Cole Merritt pulled his truck off the road at 6:47 in the morning, not because he had somewhere to be. He hadn't had somewhere to be in 11 months. He pulled over because the gas gauge had been sitting on empty for the last 30 miles, and because the sign he'd just passed, hand-painted white letters on green wood, nailed to a fence post at a slight angle, said simply, Briggs Diner. Open. Hot coffee. He sat in the truck for a moment after he cut the engine. The heater ticked as it cooled. In the back seat, Ranger lifted his head, ears forward, dark eyes moving from the windshield to Cole and back again, with the patient assessing quality of a partner waiting for orders. Yeah, Cole said quietly. Let's go. Cole was 38 years old. He didn't look it in the way that men who've spent their lives indoors don't look their age. He looked it in the other way, in the set of his jaw, in the steadiness of his hands, in the particular quality of his eyes, which had the stillness of a man who had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by it. He was 6 feet tall and lean in the way that comes from years of carrying weight over long distances rather than hours in a gym. His hair was dark and cut short from habit. He wore a canvas jacket that had been through too many winters and boots that had walked on 4 continents. He had spent 12 years as a Navy SEAL. 12 years of doing things that required him to be precise, disciplined, and completely certain of his purpose at all times. 12 years of structure so rigid, it became the skeleton of his identity, the thing holding everything else upright. And then 11 months ago, the structure ended. The papers were signed, the uniform was folded, and Cole Merritt walked out of the building where he'd spent the better part of his adult life and stood in a parking lot in Virginia Beach with a duffel bag, a retired military working dog, and no idea what came next. He thought it would get easier. That's what they told you. Give it time. Civilian life opens up. You'll find your footing. 11 months later, he was pulling into a gravel lot outside a half-forgotten diner in the mountains of Montana, running on fumes in every sense of the word. And footing was still something other people seemed to have. He drifted mostly, not dramatically, not in the way that made headlines or concerned caseworkers. He drifted the way a man drifts when he doesn't want to ask for help and doesn't know what he'd ask for even if he did. He drove. He worked short stints construction in Idaho, fence repair in Wyoming, 3 weeks at a lumber yard in Oregon that ended when his sleep stopped coming and his hands started shaking and he decided he needed to be somewhere else. He slept in motels when he had the money, in the truck when he didn't. He ate when he remembered to. He kept moving because stopping felt too much like surrender. Ranger was the only constant. Ranger was a German shepherd, 8 years old, with a coat the color of charcoal and autumn wheat. He had served 6 years in the Navy's military working dog program, first in Iraq, and then in Afghanistan, partnered with Cole for the last 4 of those years. They had been through things together that Cole didn't talk about, and Ranger didn't need to. They had the kind of bond that forms in darkness, not explained, not sentimental, just real in the way that only things tested by fire become real. When Cole was discharged, Ranger was retired simultaneously. Their paperwork went through on the same day, which felt like either a coincidence or a mercy, depending on how you looked at it. Cole hadn't hesitated. He signed the adoption forms before the ink on his own separation papers was dry. There was no version of what came next that didn't include Ranger. Now Ranger dropped out of the truck and stood beside Cole in the gravel lot, breath rising in small white clouds, scanning the property with the same quiet thoroughness he applied to everything. His ears moved independently, tracking sounds Cole couldn't hear. His nose lifted twice, reading the cold air with the systematic patience of a professional. The diner was not impressive. It sat low against the tree line, a long rectangular building with weathered wood siding that had once been painted a deep green and was now the color of something that had given up. The roof had a slight sag on the eastern end. One of the front windows had been repaired with a strip of clear tape along a diagonal crack. A neon sign in the other window read, "Open the O," flickering uncertainly as though it hadn't fully committed to the declaration. A small wooden sign beside the door said, "Established 1964. Still here." Cole almost smiled at that last part. He pushed the door open. A bell above it announced his arrival to no one in particular. Inside the diner was warm. That was the first thing, genuinely deeply warm, the kind that comes from a real kitchen running and an actual heating system that someone remembered to maintain. The booths were red vinyl worn thin at the seats, patched in a couple of places, with strips of tape that matched nothing. The counter ran the length of the room with 8 stools, 4 of which wobbled. The tile floor was clean. The coffee smell was strong and real. A small television mounted in the corner played a local news segment on mute, the weatherman gesturing at a map of approaching systems with the particular enthusiasm of a man who finds storms genuinely exciting. There was one customer, an older man in a booth by the window, nursing a mug and a newspaper. He didn't look up. Behind the counter stood Walt Briggs. Walt was 74 years old and looked at the way good timber looks, its age worn smooth in places, carrying the marks of decades, but fundamentally solid. He was a large man who had been larger once, broad through the shoulders with hands that had spent a lifetime working. His hair was white and thin, his face deeply lined, his eyes a particular shade of pale blue that seemed to take in everything without effort. He moved behind the counter with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned long ago not to waste motion. Each gesture purposeful, nothing performed, nothing wasted. He noticed Ranger before he noticed Cole. He looked at the dog the way people who know dogs look, not with surprise or hesitation, but with a particular quality of recognition. His eyes traveled from Ranger's posture to his build to the faint scar along his left shoulder, and something in Walt's expression settled like a man who has just identified something he had been trying to name. "Service dog?" Walt asked. "Retired," Cole said, settling onto a stool at the far end of the counter. Walt set down the rag he was holding. "Both of you." Cole looked at him for a moment. "Both of us." Walt nodded once, the way men nod when they've received confirmation of something they already suspected. He poured a mug of coffee and set it in front of Cole without being asked. Then he reached under the counter and produced a ceramic bowl, filled it with water from the tap, and placed it on the floor beside the stool. Ranger drank. Cole wrapped both hands around the mug and let the heat move through his palms. Outside, the first thin flakes of snow had begun to fall, drifting past the window in no particular hurry. "Long drive?" Walt asked. "Long enough." "Hungry?" Cole thought about it genuinely, which was something he didn't always do. "Yeah, actually, yeah." Walt disappeared into the kitchen without ceremony. Cole heard the sound of a pan, the hiss of something hitting heat. Ranger finished the water and lay down beside the stool, his chin on his paws, his eyes half closed but ears still moving with that independent, continuous attention that never fully switched off. The older customer by the window folded his newspaper, left a 5 on the table, and walked out without speaking to anyone. The bell above the door rang his departure. Then there was just the sound of the kitchen and the quiet hum of the heating system and the faint murmur of the muted television. And Cole sat at the counter and felt a specific, unfamiliar sensation of being somewhere that didn't require anything from him. Cole and Walt were alone. Walt brought eggs, toast, and a second cup of coffee. He didn't hover. He went back to wiping down the counter, cleaning the already clean surface with the patient repetition of a man filling time he's made peace with. Cole ate in silence for a while. The food was simple and tasted like someone had actually made it, seasoned, correctly cooked, with attention, the kind of breakfast that requires a person rather than a process. After a while, Walt spoke again, not intrusively, just the way men do when they've been alone long enough that conversation becomes as natural as weather. "What branch?" he asked. Cole looked up. "Navy." Figured, the dog's build. Military working dogs have a particular look. Walt set down the rag. "Marines have 'em. Army. But there's something about the Navy dogs. They're calmer, like they learned the same patience their handlers did." Cole considered that. "What branch were you?" "Army. Korea." Walt said it the way men of his generation say it, factually, without drama, as though war were simply one chapter among many, rather than the thing that restructures everything before and after it. 52 to 54. I was 19. Cole did the math without thinking. 72 years since Korea. The man had been carrying that longer than Cole had been alive. "You ever talk about it?" Cole asked. "Not much. Not for a long time." Walt refilled Cole's coffee without asking. "Then I stopped not talking about it. Found it helped more than I expected." He paused. "You've been back long?" 11 months. And Cole turned the mug in his hands. Outside, the snow was coming down more steadily, now laying a thin white coat over the parking lot and the highway beyond. And nothing mostly. Walt didn't press. He didn't offer advice or optimism or the well-meaning reassurances that Cole had been collecting from people for most of a year, the cheerful predictions about finding purpose, the suggestions about therapy, the particular brand of encouragement that felt like being told the weather would improve by someone who wasn't standing in the rain. He simply accepted the answer as complete, which it was, and moved on. They talked for 3 hours. Not continuously, it came in stretches, comfortable silence between them, punctuated by Walt refilling cups and Cole finding words he hadn't expected to find. He talked about the structure of military life and the absence of it, about driving through states he'd never wanted to visit, not because they were interesting, but because forward motion was easier than stillness. About the way certain sounds still pulled at him in the wrong direction. About Ranger, what it had been like to work beside him overseas, what it was like now to drive in silence with him and feel that something essential had survived, even if everything else was uncertain. Walt listened, actually listened in the way that's rarer than it should be, not preparing his response, not waiting for the pause to insert his experience, but actually receiving what Cole said and holding it for a moment before speaking. It was the listening of a man who understood that some things don't need fixing, they need witnessing. Walt talked about his own return from Korea, the way the world had simply expected him to resume, as though the intervening years were a detour rather than a transformation. Go back to normal, as though normal were a place you could return to after seeing what he'd seen. He'd come back to this valley, married his wife Della, and opened this diner because he needed something physical to pour himself into, something that required his hands every morning, something that asked a question he knew how to answer. "Della passed in 2019, Walt said. His voice didn't break, but something shifted in it, the small gear change of a man navigating grief he's learned to carry rather than set down. My kids are in Phoenix and Seattle. They call on Sundays." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the snow was settling properly now, unhurried and thorough, covering the parking lot in a clean, even layer. "You think about selling?" Cole asked. Walt looked at the room for a long moment, taking it in the way people look at places they've spent most of their life, with the complex vision of someone who sees not just what is there, but everything that has happened in it. "I think about a lot of things," he said carefully. "Mostly I think about what this place is supposed to be and whether it still is." Cole didn't answer that. He wasn't sure it needed one. He came back the next day. He told himself it was because the motel down the road was $40 a night and the booth at Briggs' Diner was free and came with coffee. That was true. It was also incomplete. He came back because Walt was someone who made sense to him, who spoke the same quiet language of men who've been through things and come out changed by them, who didn't require explanation or performance or the exhausting work of seeming fine. Sitting at that counter felt like taking off equipment he'd been wearing so long He'd forgotten it was there. And Ranger liked him, which meant more than Cole would have admitted out loud. Each morning for 2 weeks, Cole arrived at 7, took the same stool, drank the same coffee, and talked with Walt in the same unhurried rhythm. Other customers came and went, a few farmers in from outlying properties, a pair of ranchers who ordered the same thing every morning without looking at the menu. Occasionally, a truck driver who had gotten off the highway and found his way here by some chain of recommendation Cole couldn't trace. The diner had never been busy, but it was always open and the coffee was always hot. And the sign outside still said, "Still here," with the quiet stubbornness of a thing that had outlasted people's expectations of it. Cole helped without being asked. He noticed that Walt's right hand shook slightly when he carried heavy loads, and so Cole started carrying them. He noticed the back storage room had a door that wouldn't stay latched, and so he fixed it with a piece of hardware he found in a box under the prep counter. He noticed that the pie case's locking mechanism had worn through its catch, and he repaired that too. Walt accepted the help without excessive gratitude, which was the right response, and made note of what Cole was capable of, which was considerable. On a Thursday morning in December, Ranger did something unusual. He had been lying in his usual spot beside Cole's stool when, without explanation, he stood across the length of the diner and stopped at the far corner behind the counter, a recessed section near the old fireplace that Walt used for storage of surplus supplies and equipment he hadn't gotten around to moving. Ranger stood there and pressed his nose to the floor. Then he began to scratch at a particular board, a wide plank of dark wood that sat slightly higher than the ones around it, warped at one edge, the grain of it darker than the surrounding boards, as though something had seeped into it from below over many years. "Ranger," Cole said it firmly. Ranger looked at him, then he looked back at the floor. Then he looked at Cole again, with the specific expression of a working dog who is trying to communicate something his handler is being too slow to understand, not frustrated exactly, but with the particular patience of an animal who has learned that humans catch up eventually if you wait them out. "Probably mice," Walt said from behind the counter. He waved a hand in the direction of the corner without looking up from what he was doing. "Old building. They get in the walls sometimes." "Ranger." Cole said his name again, and the dog came back reluctantly and lay down. But he kept his eyes on that corner of the floor for the rest of the morning, and twice more during the following week he returned to the same spot and stood there with his nose to the board until Cole called him back. Cole noticed something the second time it happened. When Ranger finally settled, Walt had stopped what he was doing behind the counter. He was looking at the corner with his pale blue eyes, and his expression wasn't the mild irritation of a man watching a dog sniff at a mouse. His expression was something else entirely. Something careful and old, and not quite ready to be named. Walt said nothing. Cole said nothing. They both looked away, and the moment passed, and the diner went on with its day the way it always did, steadily without drama. One cup of coffee at a time. The moment that changed everything arrived on a Thursday evening, 17 days after Cole first walked through the door. The last customer had left 40 minutes earlier. The open sign had been switched off. The highway outside was quiet in the way that Montana highways go quiet after dark, not just empty, but genuinely still, as though the landscape itself had shifted modes. Walt was at the counter with 2 cups of coffee, one in front of Cole, one in front of himself, and a manila folder that he had placed on the counter between them but hadn't opened yet. For a long time he didn't speak. He turned his mug in his hands. The snow outside had picked up and was coming down in earnest now, laying itself across the parking lot, in the highway, in the pine trees beyond, filling in the spaces between things, the way winter does when it means business. "I've been thinking about what you said," Walt said finally, "about moving, about not having a direction." Cole waited. "I've been thinking about it for a while, actually, since before you walked in here." Walt opened the folder slowly with the deliberate movement of a man who has thought a long time about a particular moment and is now inside it. Inside was a single document, several pages printed with signatures at the bottom, and a stamp Cole recognized as notarial. "I'm not going to be able to run this place much longer. My hands are getting worse. The drive some mornings is harder than it used to be. My doctor has opinions I'm not ready to agree with yet, but that doesn't make him wrong. Cole said nothing. He looked at the folder without touching it. My kids don't want it. I've asked. They've got their lives, and I don't hold that against them. Walt looked up. But I've been watching you for 2 weeks. I've watched you work on this building without being asked. I've watched you talk to veterans who came through that door like they were worth someone's real attention. I've watched your dog. He paused. I was you, Cole. 50 years ago, I came back from a war and I didn't know what came next, and this building gave me an answer. He slid the folder across the counter. I wanted to do the same thing for you. Cole looked at the folder without touching it. Walt. It's a deed transfer. I had Claire Novak in Billings draw it up. She's the best real estate attorney in the state, and she owes me a favor from 2003 that I'm finally collecting on. The corner of Walt's mouth moved slightly, the minimal version of a smile. The price is $1. I'd ask you to pay it now so it's legal. Cole stared at him. I'm serious, Walt said. I know you're serious. Then what's the problem? Cole turned away from the folder. He looked at the room, at the worn vinyl booths and the cracked window and the flickering neon and the coffee maker that needed a new heating element in the ceiling with its one water stain in the shape of a bird in flight. He looked at all of it with a particular vision of a man who can see not what something is, but what it could be given sufficient time and intention and work. Why, Cole asked. The real reason. Walt was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind pushed against the building, and the structure creaked in the familiar way of old wood settling into cold, the sound of something that had been standing a long time and intended to keep standing. Because some buildings have a purpose that outlasts the people who built them. And I want to make sure this one finds its next reason before I run out of time to give it one. He looked at Cole steadily, the pale blue eyes direct and unhurried. And because your dog keeps going back to that corner. And I think he's been right about things longer than either of us has been paying attention. Cole looked at Ranger. Ranger was already at the corner, paw on the warped board, eyes on Cole. Cole reached into his pocket, found a dollar bill that had been there since Wyoming soft from handling creased through the middle. The kind of bill that has been in someone's pocket long enough to lose any significance beyond its technical function, and placed it on the counter. Walt picked it up and put it in the register. They signed the paperwork that night. It took 40 minutes and required a notary. Walt had arranged in advance a woman named Ruth from 2 towns over who arrived with a stamp in a professional absence of curiosity and left the same way. Cole signed where he was told to sign. Walt signed where he was told to sign. Ruth stamped everything, handed Cole his copies, told him it was nice to meet him, and drove back into the snow. When she left, Cole sat at the counter with the deed in his hands, a document transferring ownership of 0.8 acres, one commercial structure, with associated fixtures and equipment, the mineral rights appurtenant thereto, and felt something he hadn't felt in 11 months. Not happiness exactly, something older and quieter than happiness. The specific gravity of a thing that matters, of an object in your hands that has actual weight because actual weight has been placed in it by someone who meant it. Walt stood up slowly and stretched his back, one hand pressed to his spine, in the practiced gesture of a man who has been having that particular conversation with his body for years. I'm going home, he said. Early morning tomorrow. You can stay in the back if you need to. There's a cot in the storage room. He paused at the door, his hand on the frame. Lock up when you're done. Walt, Cole said. The old man turned. Thank you. Walt nodded once. The same nod as the first morning, the one that meant he had received something he had already suspected. Get some sleep, son. The bell rang as the door closed. Cole listened to Walt's truck start in the parking lot, the engine warming up for longer than a healthy engine should need, to the particular patience of an old vehicle being treated with respect. He listened to it pull out onto the highway and fade into the distance until there was nothing left but the sound of the snow and the creaking of the building and the small sounds Ranger made settling himself back into his spot beside the stool. Cole sat at the counter alone. Outside, the snow was falling heavy now, the highway invisible beyond 20 yards. The diner creaked in the wind, the particular sound of an old structure settling into cold, familiar, almost comfortable. The kind of sound that after enough time stops being noise and becomes part of the silence. Ranger had returned to the corner and was sitting with his back straight and his eyes fixed on the warped floorboard, not with the alert tension of a working dog on a threat, but with the calm, steady attention of a sentinel whose watch is voluntary. Cole's phone buzzed, unknown number. He almost didn't answer. "Mr. Merritt?" A man's voice, smooth, professional, and carrying the specific warmth of someone who has learned to use warmth as a tool to deploy it like equipment rather than feel it like weather. "My name is Dale Voss. I represent Ridgeline Group. I understand you've recently acquired the Briggs property." Cole said nothing. He looked at the deed in his hand. "We've been trying to reach Mr. Briggs for some time. We have a standing offer on that land, a very generous one. I'd love to sit down with you this week and discuss what that could mean for your situation." Cole looked at Ranger, still stationed at the corner, one paw resting on the warped board, with the proprietary patience of a man who has decided that a particular piece of ground is his to guard. "Not interested," Cole said. A pause. Then the warmth in Voss's voice receded just slightly, not gone, but thinned to something that revealed the architecture underneath. "I understand. Think it over. Old buildings have a way of becoming liabilities, Mr. Merritt, more than new owners usually expect." The line went dead. Cole set his phone face down on the counter. He looked at the room again, at the walls that needed painting, and the roof that needed work, and the heating element that needed replacing, and the corner where his dog sat guard over something neither of them fully understood yet. He thought about Walt's voice earlier in the quiet moment before Ruth arrived, when the two of them had been alone for a moment, and Walt had said something Cole had almost missed beneath the weight of everything else happening. "Don't let anyone change what this place is, Cole. Some buildings know something, and some dogs know better than their people." At 11:40 that night, Cole's phone rang again. Walt's number this time. He answered immediately. "Walt." Static, breathing. Then Walt's voice, but wrong. Quieter than it should be, and thin in the way that voices go thin when something in the body is failing, when the systems that normally run invisibly in the background have been asked to do more than they are currently able. "Cole, I need you to listen." "Walt, what's wrong? Where are you?" I called the ambulance already. They're coming." A pause, shallow breath. "I need to tell you something before." Another pause, and Cole could hear the effort in it, the specific effort of a man trying to stay present in a moment that is pulling him towards somewhere else. The corner, the floor. "Don't let them near it, Cole. Woo. Don't let anyone near that floor." His voice was fading now. Ranger knows. He always knew. The sound of emergency tones in the background. Walt's breathing going uneven, finding a new rhythm that was not quite right. "Walt, I'm coming." "No, stay. The building needs—" A sound Cole recognized and hated, the sound of a body's systems beginning to override intention of the conscious while losing its argument with the physical. "Stay. Trust the dog." The line went quiet. Not dead, the call was still connected. Cole could hear it on the other end, the dispatcher Walt's ragged breathing settling into something more regular, as trained hands took over the ambulance, arriving voices taking charge with the calm efficiency of people whose job is exactly this. Cole stood at the counter. He was already in his jacket, keys in hand, every military instinct in him pulling toward the door, toward action, toward the problem, toward the person who needed help. His hands were steady. His mind was clear. His body was ready for movement in the way it had been trained to be, ready the way it sometimes still came alive when everything else had gone quiet and uncertain. But Walt had said, "Stay." And Cole had spent 12 years learning that sometimes the hardest order to follow is the one that requires you to hold your position when everything in you is screaming to move. He sat back down. Ranger had not moved from the corner. He sat with his spine straight and his eyes on the warpboard patient, certain unmovable, the way he sat when he had found something important and was waiting for Cole to be ready to understand what came next. Outside the diner, the snow fell without interruption. The highway was white and empty and silent. The pines stood perfectly still, holding their snow without complaint. And somewhere beneath the old floorboard in the corner, in the dark and the cold, something waited. Something Walt Briggs had hidden 30 years ago. Something a dog with better instincts than his handler had known about since the first morning they walked through that door. Something that Cole didn't know this yet, sitting at the counter with a deed in his hands and his phone pressed to his ear and his dog keeping watch across the room, was going to require every skill he'd spent 12 years building. Not to fight a war, to finish one. Part 2, What the Dog Knew. The hospital in Harlow Creek was small, 12 beds, one overnight physician, a nursing staff that knew most patients by first name before they arrived. Cole drove there at 6 in the morning after spending the night on the cot in the diner's back room with Ranger lying across the doorway and the deed folded in his jacket pocket and Walt's last words playing on a low, steady loop in the back of his mind. The corner, the floor. Ranger knows. Walt was stable. That was what the nurse at the front desk told him, stable, resting, no visitors until afternoon. She said it with the practiced neutrality of someone who had delivered that word in every possible direction, good and bad, and had learned to make it mean only exactly what it said. Cole drove back to the diner. He stood in the parking lot for a moment in the early light, hands in his jacket pockets, breath rising in slow clouds. The building looked different to him now. Not better or worse different in the way that things look different when they belong to you, when the relationship between you and an object has shifted from visitor to owner, and everything you see becomes simultaneously an assessment and a responsibility. Every flaw was visible and personal. The sagging roofline on the east end, the cracked window with its strip of tape, the parking lot with its broken asphalt heaved up by years of frost and neglect. His now. All of it. He unlocked the front door, let Ranger in ahead of him, and stood in the center of the diner. The corner was the first thing Ranger went to. Same warped board, same patient-insistent posture, same eyes moving from the floor to Cole and back, with the particular expression of a working dog who has decided that his handler's slowness is a temporary condition that will eventually correct itself if given sufficient time. Not yet, Cole said quietly. He started the coffee maker. The work began that first full day and did not stop. Cole had grown up in rural Ohio, the son of a man who believed that a person's relationship with a building was a moral matter, that you either took care of what you owned or you didn't deserve to own it. He had spent his childhood learning to fix things: plumbing, electrical, carpentry, roofing. He had learned early that work done well had a particular quality, that work done carelessly never achieved a precision of fit, a rightness of function, a satisfaction in the finished thing that was its own argument for doing it properly in the first place. He had spent 12 years in the Navy learning to work precisely under pressure, to assess a situation without sentiment, to identify what needed doing and do it in the correct order without letting the scale of the problem interfere with the execution of the next step. The diner needed everything. He started with the kitchen because the kitchen was what made the building operational. Without it, there was no diner, only a cold room with furniture. He replaced the heating element in the coffee maker with a part he ordered online and picked up from a supply house in Billings. He reseated the gas line connection on the range that had been leaking a slow, thin hiss for what looked like months, the kind of thing that becomes invisible through familiarity, noticed only by someone coming to it fresh. He replaced the seal on the walk-in refrigerator door. He fixed the latch on the back storage room again more permanently, this time using a piece of hardware that was sized correctly for the door rather than the improvised solution it had been living with. He worked from 6 in the morning until the light failed, then by work lamp until his hands told him to stop. He ate whatever was in the kitchen. He slept on the cot. He visited Walt every afternoon. The old man was awake by the third day, sitting up in the hospital bed with the remote control in one hand and the expression of a man who considered his own convalescence an imposition on his schedule. "You don't have to come every day," Walt said on the fourth afternoon. "I know," Cole said, and came every day. Walt didn't talk about the phone call from the night of the ambulance. Cole didn't ask about the floor. They both understood the way men of a particular formation understand things, that there was a right time for that conversation, and it hadn't arrived yet. Some things require the right conditions, the right amount of trust, the right moment of stillness, the right sense that the person across from you is ready to carry what you're about to hand them. On the eighth day, a pickup truck turned into the parking lot. Cole was on the roof replacing 3 cracked shingles along the eastern slope. When he heard the tires on the gravel, he looked down. 2 men stepped out, both older 60s, wearing insulated work jackets and veteran ball caps. One Army, one Marines, based on the insignia. They stood in the lot and looked at the building the way men look at something they remember, with a specific expression of recognition mixed with the mild surprise of something being different from how you left it. Cole came down from the roof and met them in the parking lot. "We heard Walt sold the place," the taller one said. "His name was Gary," he said, "and he'd been coming to Briggs' Diner since 1987. The other one was Frank. Frank had been coming since 1993 when he moved to the Valley after his second tour ended and found that the diner was one of the few places where the silence between sentences meant something comfortable rather than something he needed to fill. He transferred it," Cole said. "I'm fixing it up." They looked at him, at his hands cut and calloused, currently holding a hammer and a pry bar. At Ranger, who had materialized from the doorway and was assessing both men with calm, professional attention, reading them the way he read everything methodically without assumption, forming his conclusion from evidence rather than impression. Gary looked at the dog, then at Cole. "You served Navy 12 years. Something shifted in both men's faces, the same gear change Cole had seen in Walt, the recognition of a shared coordinate, a place on the map both men knew without having visited together. It was not sentiment. It was something more practical than sentiment. The acknowledgement of a common context, a shared understanding of certain specific things that couldn't be explained to people who hadn't been there and didn't require explanation to people who had. "We'll help," Frank said. It wasn't a question. Cole looked at them for a moment. He was not a man who asked for help easily or accepted it without resistance. 11 months of solitary drift had calcified that tendency further. But he had been working alone for 8 days, and the roof had 6 more bad sections, and he was beginning to understand something about this building that Walt had understood for decades, that it did not belong to one person, that it never had, that its function required more than one set of hands. "You know anything about roofing?" Cole asked. "I roofed my own house in 2009, Gary said. "Twice, actually. First time I did it wrong." "Good enough," Cole said and handed him the pry bar. They came back the next day. They brought 2 more men, veterans from the Valley, who had heard through the particular informal network that exists among men who've served and settled in the same area. The network that doesn't use phones or social media, but moves through conversations at gas stations and hardware stores with the quiet efficiency of things that matter, finding their way to people who understand why they matter. The day after that, 3 more arrived, a Vietnam vet named Harold, who moved slowly but measured twice before cutting once, and 2 Gulf War veterans named Torres and Jim, who worked in easy silence and laughed at things that didn't require explanation, who understood each other's shorthand and didn't mind Cole's. Cole hadn't advertised anything. He hadn't posted anything online or put a sign in the window. He had simply been visible, a man working on a building that veterans had been coming to for decades, and visibility was enough. Some things don't need to be announced. They just need to be happening, and the right people find their way to them. The diner began to change. The roof was repaired section by section. The bad shingles replaced the eastern sag, addressed with new structural support that Gary had the knowledge to install correctly. The cracked window was replaced with new glass that Cole fitted himself. The parking lot got a load of gravel to fill the worst of the heaves. The walls inside were stripped of old yellowing tape and a film of accumulated grease that had been building since the Carter administration, then repainted a warm cream color Cole found in the back storage room, 3 gallons of it unopened, as though Walt had bought it years ago and been waiting for someone else to apply it to the walls he had stopped seeing because he'd been looking at them too long. Cole found a box of photographs in the same storage room behind the paint cans in a stack of old menus. Military photos. Men in uniform from different eras, different branches, different conflicts. Some framed, some loose, some in envelopes with names written on the outside in handwriting that covered several decades. He spent an evening at the counter going through them carefully and then hung them along the wall beside the register, creating a gallery that ran from Korea to Afghanistan, organized not by war or branch or chronology, but by something harder to name, the particular quality of expression that men carry. When they have been somewhere, most people haven't a quality that persists across generations and conflicts in the 50 years of difference between the oldest photograph and the newest. Walt's photo went in the center. Korea, 1953. Walt at 19, lean and serious in a uniform that looked 3 sizes too large on a frame that hadn't finished filling out yet. The young man in the photograph bore only a passing resemblance to the 74-year-old behind the counter Cole had met 3 weeks ago. But the eyes were the same. The particular quality of the attention in them was identical, the same pale blue steadiness, the same sense of a man who was watching carefully and drawing his own conclusions. The morning after Cole hung the photos, Gary came in early and saw the wall. He stood in front of it for a long time without speaking, his coffee cup in both hands. He looked at Walt's photograph, and then at the others, and then back at Walt's. Then he sat at the counter and ordered coffee and didn't say anything about the wall at all. But he came back the next morning, and the morning after that. On the 14th day, Dale Voss came back in person. Cole was behind the counter when the SUV pulled in. Black knew the kind of vehicle that announces that the person inside it has sufficient money that the vehicle's cost is not something they think about. Voss was in his 50s, well-dressed, in the understated way of men whose wealth is old enough to have stopped needing to prove itself. He had silver hair, a careful smile, and the particular physical ease of a man who was accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around his presence rather than the other way around. He sat at the counter and ordered coffee, which Cole brought without ceremony, without warmth, without the small social performances that the man's manner seemed to expect. "You've done good work here," Voss said, looking around the diner with an expression that managed to be complimentary and evaluative simultaneously, as though he were appraising a property he intended to acquire and had found it in better condition than expected. "I mean that genuinely." "I know what you mean," Cole said. Voss smiled. "I want to be direct with you, Mr. Merritt. Ridgeline Group has a significant development project planned for this corridor. Highway 12 is going to change substantially over the next 3 years. New infrastructure, commercial development, substantial investment in this area." He set his coffee down. "The Briggs property sits at a critical point in our planning. We've been trying to acquire it for some time." "Walt told you no," Cole said. "Walt was dealing with a complicated situation. We understand that. Our offer to you is substantially better than what we offered him. I think you'd find it—" "No," Cole said. Voss turned the coffee cup in his hands. The smile didn't disappear, but it thinned the warmth, backing off by a precise, controlled degree, revealing the architecture of calculation underneath. "I'd encourage you to think carefully. You're taking on a significant financial commitment here. A building this age, in this condition, there are costs that aren't visible yet. Costs that have a way of becoming problems at the worst possible times." Cole looked at him directly and held the look for a moment without speaking, the way a man looks at something he is measuring. "Is that a warning or a threat?" "It's an observation," Voss said pleasantly. He stood, left a 10 on the counter for a $2 coffee, and walked to the door with the unhurried confidence of a man who has not yet experienced a situation he couldn't manage. He stopped there and turned back. We'll be in touch, Mr. Merritt. The offer won't stay open indefinitely. The bell rang as the door closed. Ranger, who had been lying beside the counter through the entire exchange, rose and went to the window. He watched the SUV back out of the lot and turn onto the highway. He watched it until it disappeared around the bend in the road. Then he turned and went back to his corner and sat down beside the warped board with the quiet certainty of a soldier returning to his post. That evening, Cole called Claire Novak in Billings. He didn't know why he had her number. Walt had mentioned her name the night they signed the deed best real estate attorney in the state, and Cole had written it down without knowing why, in the automatic way of a man trained to record intelligence before he knows whether it will be useful. It was the same instinct that made him note the license plate of the black SUV that had been parked at the edge of the property 3 evenings running. Claire Novak picked up on the second ring. She had a voice that suggested she operated at roughly twice the speed of most people and had made peace with that disparity long ago, efficient without being brusque, direct, without being unkind. Walt Briggs mentioned you might call, she said before Cole finished introducing himself. How is he stable? Getting better. Good, what do you need? Ridgeline Group, Cole said. They want to buy the diner. They're being persistent in a way I don't like. A pause on the line. Not long, half a second, the kind of pause a person makes when they recognize a name they have a file on and are deciding how much of that file to open immediately. How persistent. The kind that includes veiled suggestions about costs becoming problems. Another pause slightly longer. Don't sign anything. Don't let anyone on the property without a warrant. And don't talk to Voss again without calling me first. Her voice had shifted, still efficient, but with an edge underneath it that hadn't been there a moment ago. I know that name, Mr. Merritt. I know that company. There are things about the Briggs property, and Ridgeline is interested in it, that you should probably understand. Tell me. Not on the phone. Come to Billings when you can. And in the meantime, she paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had the particular quality of someone choosing their words with legal precision, selecting them for what they said exactly rather than what they might imply. Walt Briggs has been holding something for a long time. I think he transferred that building to you because he trusted you to understand what that meant. More than that, what it would require. Cole looked across the diner at the corner, at Ranger sitting straight beside the warped board, eyes half closed, in the particular way of a she who has been waiting so long that patience itself has become the mission. I'm beginning to understand, Cole said. The night the floor gave way, the storm had been building since afternoon. Montana winter storms have a specific character. They don't announce themselves dramatically. They arrive by accumulation, the sky lowering by degrees, the temperature dropping in increments too gradual to mark precisely the wind picking up by small additions, until without any single moment you can identify the world outside has become something that demands to be taken seriously. By 8 o'clock, the highway was invisible beyond 30 yards. The temperature outside had dropped to 14 degrees. The pines were bending now under the weight of the accumulation. By 9, the power had been flickering for an hour and finally went out at 9:17 with the particular finality of a system that has made its decision, leaving Cole in the sudden absolute darkness of a building with no emergency lighting. He found his headlamp in his duffel bag and clicked it on. The beam swept the diner in a slow arc, the counter, the booths, the photograph wall, the television mounted dark in the corner. Ranger was already standing, not at the corner. In the middle of the room, facing the corner body, rigid with a quality of attention that Cole recognized immediately and that his own body responded to with a specific kind of alertness. Cole had seen that posture before, not often and not in buildings. He had seen it in Ramadi and in a district outside Kabul in the specific seconds before Ranger indicated an IED buried in a road or a cache hidden in a wall. It was the posture of a dog who was no longer offering a suggestion. This was not a pet investigating an interesting smell. This was a trained military working dog executing an alert on something located, something identified, something present. Okay, Cole said quietly. Okay, Ranger, show me. Ranger crossed to the corner in 4 quick strides and stopped at the warp board. He looked at Cole and barked once short, sharp, certain. The bark of a dog who has been waiting for permission to do what he has known needed doing for weeks. Cole knelt beside him. He ran his hands along the edge of the board, feeling the slight elevation, the soft give that suggested the wood beneath had separated from its substrate, not from rot exactly, but from deliberate preparation from a gap that had been engineered rather than occurred. He took out his utility knife and worked the blade into the gap at the edge, applying slow, steady pressure. The board shifted, then the one beside it. Then with a sound like a sentence that had been waiting 30 years to be finished, a section of floor roughly 3 feet by 4 feet dropped away entirely, not collapsed chaotically, but detached cleanly in a single piece, as though it had been designed to open exactly this way, as though someone had built the mechanism of its opening into the original installation and then covered it over and waited. Below, in a space between the old floorboards and the concrete foundation, sat a military-issue lockbox. Black steel, reinforced corners. A 4-digit combination lock of a pattern Cole had seen in armories from Virginia to Afghanistan. The metal was cold and slightly damp, but structurally intact, not corroded, not compromised. Someone had packed the space around it with foam insulation of the kind used for camping equipment, compressed over time into something denser than it had started as, but still functional, still doing exactly what it had been placed there to do. Cole sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long moment, the headlamp casting a circle of light around the opening in the floor. Ranger sat beside him, breathing normally. Now his alert completed, waiting for whatever came next, with the particular equanimity of a working dog who has done his job and trusts his handler to do his. Cole did not open the lockbox that night. He lifted it out of the floor and set it on the counter, and it was heavier than its size suggested, dense in the way of things that have been carefully packed, that have been given the weight of intention as well as contents. He placed it there and stood with his hands on the counter and looked at it and thought about Walt's voice on the phone, "Don't let them near that floor," and about Claire Novak's careful, precise language, and about the black SUV that had been parked at the edge of the property these past 3 evenings. Opening it felt like a decision that deserved more than a power outage and a headlamp. It deserved daylight and the full weight of awareness, not the compromised attention of a man operating at midnight after a long day's work. He drove to the hospital first thing in the morning. Walt was better. He was eating solid food and had strong opinions about the television programming, and had asked one of the nurses to bring him a crossword book, which Cole took as a reliable indicator of recovering cognitive function. When Cole walked in, Walt looked at him for a moment with the specific attention of a man reading a report, assessing, recalibrating, drawing a conclusion. "You found it," Walt said. "Last night, the floor gave during the storm." Walt was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands where they rested on the blanket. "I was going to tell you when I got out. I didn't expect—" He stopped, started again. "Is it safe?" "Locked in the truck, nobody saw." Walt exhaled a slow, deliberate release of something he had been carrying at a particular tension for a long time. "The combination is 1953. Year I shipped out." He looked up. "There's a letter in there. Read it before you open anything else. Promise me that." "I promise." "The USB drive," Walt said. "Walt, take it to Claire before you look at it. I need her to be in the room when you see what's on it. There are things on that drive that require context, and she has the context." "I'll take it tomorrow." Walt looked at the window. Outside, the sky was the pale, washed-out blue of a Montana winter day after a storm has passed through clean and cold, and very still, the kind of sky that exists only after things have been cleared away. "I've been carrying this for 30 years, Cole. I'm sorry to hand it to you, but I didn't know who else." He stopped again, looked at his hands. "Walt," Cole said, "I've got it." He opened the lockbox that afternoon at the counter alone. The combination turned on the first try. Inside, packed with the careful precision of a man who had once been trained to prepare for uncertainty, who had learned in Korea that the things you plan for are the things you survive, were 5 items. A handwritten letter sealed in a plastic zip bag that had kept it dry for 30 years. A USB drive in a foam-padded protective case. A folded survey map, original hand-drawn, dated 1962, showing property boundaries along a 12-mile stretch of Highway 12 in fine, precise lines. A manila envelope containing what appeared to be legal documents with multiple signatures and official stamps. And Walt's Korea War Service Medal, bronze on its original ribbon in a small case with a glass front, the kind of case that a man keeps not to display the medal, but to protect it, to keep it from being touched by the ordinary air of ordinary days. Cole opened the letter first. Walt's handwriting was deliberate and clear, a man who had learned to write in an era when penmanship was considered a form of character, when the legibility of your hand was a statement about the legibility of your mind. Cole, if you're reading this, then what I couldn't say in person needs to be said on paper. I'll be direct because I think that's what you need and what I owe you. Ridgeline Group is not a development company in the ordinary sense. For the past 11 years, they have been systematically acquiring land along the Highway 12 corridor using methods that are not legal. They identify properties owned by elderly residents, veterans, and low-income families. They manufacture pressure zoning complaints, false code violations, tax disputes, noise ordinances. They make the cost of holding on seem higher than the cost of selling, and they buy at a fraction of fair value. I watched them take 9 properties in this valley before I understood what they was doing. By the time I understood, I had already been approached. They offered me $40,000 for land worth $400,000. When I refused, the pressure started. Code inspectors showed up. My business license was questioned. A water main on my property was discovered to be in violation of an ordinance that had apparently existed for 30 years without anyone noticing. I started documenting everything. Every conversation I had with their representatives, every official visit that followed my refusals, every property transaction I could find in the county records going back to when they first appeared in this valley. It's all on the drive. 11 years of evidence organized so that anyone who knows what they're looking at can follow the thread. The reason I couldn't go to law enforcement is on the drive too. The reason I needed to find someone who could hold this and know what to do with it is also on the drive. Take it to Claire. She has been waiting for this longer than you have known her, and she will know exactly what to do with every piece of it. The map shows what they actually want. It is not the diner. It is what the diner sits on top of. Trust Ranger. He led you to that box because that is what he does. He reads the ground better than people read anything. I'm sorry for the weight of this, Cole, but I have watched you work for 2 weeks, and I have watched your dog, and I have thought about this for a long time. You have been trained to carry weight that would break other men. That is not nothing. That is everything. Walt Cole set the letter down. He sat with it for a long time in the quiet of the diner, with the afternoon light coming through the repaired window, at the particular angle it found at this time of year, and the sound of a truck passing on the highway every few minutes, and Ranger lying beside the stool with his chin on his paws, watching Cole with the patient, steadying attention he had applied to Cole's worst moments across 4 years in 2 continents. Cole picked up his phone and called Claire Novak. I have the box, he said when she answered. He heard her exhale not with surprise, but with the specific relief of a person who has been waiting for a particular call for a long time and had begun, in the small hours of difficult nights, to consider the possibility that it might not come. Are you safe? For now. Bring the drive to my office tomorrow morning. Don't look at it before you come. I need to be in the room when you see what's on it. A brief pause. And Cole Walt made the right choice. I want you to know that. Whoever he was waiting for someone who wouldn't walk away from what's on that drive. Don't walk away from it. I won't, Cole said. That evening, Danny Reeves walked into the diner. Cole almost didn't notice him at first. It was close to 6 o'clock. The diner was technically closed. The open sign-off, and Cole had been sitting at the counter with Walt's letter in his hands, reading it for the third time, not because he hadn't understood it, but because understanding something and being ready to act on it are different things that sometimes require multiple readings to bridge. The bell above the door rang, and Cole looked up, expecting Gary or Frank, who had developed the habit of stopping by in the early evening for coffee and whatever conversation presented itself. Instead, it was a young man he'd never seen before. He was in his mid-20s, wearing a worn military jacket, Army 3rd Infantry Division, patch on the shoulder, the sleeve frayed at the cuff in the way sleeves go when a jacket is worn every day regardless of occasion. He was thin in the way that isn't about diet, the specific thinness of someone who has been forgetting to eat because eating requires a certain minimum of self-care that had been difficult to maintain. He had the specific tiredness behind his eyes that Cole recognized not because he had read about it in a pamphlet, but because he'd seen it in his own face in motel bathroom mirrors for the better part of a year. He stood just inside the door with the hesitation of someone who has driven a long way towards something and is no longer entirely certain he should have come, as though the actual arrival had raised questions that the driving had kept at bay. Cole didn't ask who he was. He didn't ask what he wanted. He said, "Sit anywhere." The young man sat in the booth closest to the door, close to the exit, back to the wall, the positioning of someone for whom spatial awareness was not a preference, but a necessity. Cole brought coffee without being asked, the same way Walt had brought it to him the first morning, setting it on the table without ceremony and going back to the counter. They didn't speak for 20 minutes. The diner was quiet around them. The heater hummed. Outside, a car passed on the highway. Ranger lay beside the counter stool, watching the young man with his dark, steady eyes. Then the young man said quietly and without preamble, "I saw the photos on the wall." Cole looked up. "I was driving through. I saw them through the window." He paused. "I've been driving for 2 days. I didn't really have a destination. I saw them and I stopped." Cole nodded. "Afghanistan," the young man said. "Third deployment. I've been back 8 months." He stopped, started again more slowly. "My family tries. They really try. But I sit at dinner and they're talking about things and I can't. I'm not there. I'm somewhere else. And I can't explain where that is without—" He stopped again. His hands around the coffee cup were very still in the deliberate way of someone who has learned to keep them still, who has made stillness into a discipline. Cole understood every word that hadn't been said. He understood it not as information, but as recognition. The recognition of a man who has lived inside the same sentence and knows exactly where it ends. Ranger stood up from beside the counter stool. He crossed the diner without hurry, without drama, and stopped beside the young man's booth. He looked at him for a moment with his dark, steady eyes, assessing, deciding. Then he lay down his body along the base of the booth seat, his weight pressing gently against the young man's feet beneath the table, warm and solid and present. The young man looked down at the dog. Something in his face shifted, a small involuntary release, like a fist that's been clenched so long that the unclenching happens not because you decided to, but because the muscle finally gave up trying. "His name's Ranger," Cole said. "He knows us." The young man's name was Danny Reeves, formerly Specialist. Danny Reeves' 3rd Infantry Division, and he had driven from Colorado because someone online in a veterans forum had mentioned this place in passing, had said it was worth the drive, without being able to fully explain why. And Danny had been in the kind of place where driving somewhere for no fully explainable reason was better than not driving anywhere at all. He sat in that booth for 3 hours. He didn't talk the entire time, but he didn't leave, which was its own kind of statement. The statement of someone who has found a place where not talking is acceptable, where the silence isn't something to be filled or apologized for. When Danny finally stood to go, Cole said, "You can come back." Danny looked at him. Yeah, the coffee's always on, Cole said. And Ranger's usually here. The attack came at 2 a.m. when the diner was dark and Cole was asleep on the cot. It was a sound that shouldn't have been there. A specific sharp report from the front of the building followed immediately by the smaller sounds of glass settling into a new configuration. Cole was off the cot before the echo had finished his body moving through the classification sequence, before conscious thought had caught up. Not a shot wrong pitch, wrong echo profile. Not mechanical failure. Impact. Glass. He went to the front room moving low. The left front window had a hole in it, circular roughly 3 inches across, with a spider web of cracks spreading outward from the impact point in the pattern of a stone hitting ice. On the floor beneath it lay a piece of concrete block, smooth-edged, wrapped in nothing. Not a threat designed to injure, a message designed to communicate. The message being, we know where you are, and we can reach you there, and we want you to know that. Ranger was beside Cole before Cole reached the window, pressing his full weight against Cole's legs. The sound hit Cole on the inside, not the window. The sound of it, the sudden sharp report in the darkness in the present dropped away for 3 seconds, the way it sometimes did with the completeness of a power outage. Heat replaced cold. Sand replaced floor. A sound he'd never been fully able to identify, echoed forward across years of trying not to remember it, arriving fully formed and demanding Ranger's weight against his legs. Warm, solid, here. Cole gripped the dog's scruff and breathed. Once, twice. I'm here. Not okay. Here, this floor, this building, this cold, this moment. He stood up straight. His hands were steady. He looked at the hole in the window for a long moment, reading it the way he'd been trained to read scenes, collecting information, forming a picture, noting what was present and what was absent. Then he took out his phone and photographed the window from 4 angles. He photographed the concrete block. He went to the door and photographed the footprints in the light snow, outside 2 sets both heading toward the road, neither in the boot pattern of anyone local he had seen in the valley. He sent all the photographs to Claire Novak's email with a timestamp and a 2-sentence description of what he was looking at. He found cardboard in the storage room and taped it over the window. Then he went back to the cot and Ranger lay across the door, and Cole lay in the darkness looking at the ceiling for a long time. He wasn't afraid. Fear wasn't quite the right word for what moved through him. In the darkness, it was something more like recognition, the specific feeling of a mission becoming real, of the abstract threat, becoming concrete of the thing you've been preparing for announcing itself. He was thinking about Walt's letter, about the 11 years it represented one man alone, building a case with a recorder and a filing system, and a floor he was willing to bury the truth under until the right person came to dig it up. He was thinking about Claire's voice on the phone, about the survey map and what the diner sat on top of. He was thinking about Ranger's alert in the middle of a storm, about the floor dropping away, about the lockbox with the combination 1953, the year a boy shipped out to a war and came back the kind of man who pressed record in a back room because his instincts told him that some things needed to be preserved. But underneath all of that thinking, something else was present. Something that had arrived without announcement, without drama, in the quiet way of things that are actually significant. He was not thinking about leaving. For 11 months, leaving had been the only mode available to him. The next town, the next state, the next stretch of highway with its clean anonymity and its promise that somewhere ahead the static in his chest might finally resolve into signal. He had been moving because stillness felt like surrender. But lying on the cot in the back room of a broken diner in Montana with a dog across the doorway, and a deed in his jacket pocket, and a lockbox of evidence on the counter, and a young veteran who had driven 2 days to sit somewhere that understood him, Cole was not thinking about the next road. He was thinking about the window. He was thinking that in the morning he would replace the glass properly, not just tape cardboard over it. He was thinking about the 6 roof sections still to fix, and the kitchen wiring that needed updating, and the sign above the door that needed new paint. He was thinking about Gary and Frank and Harold and Torres and Jim, who would show up in the morning without being asked, because that was what they did now. He was thinking about Danny Reeves and the way the tiredness had shifted in his eyes when Ranger lay down beside his booth. He was thinking that Walt had handed him something much larger than a building. And outside, beyond the patch window in the silent highway and the dark tree line, the black SUV was parked 200 yards east, engine off, lights off, watching the diner in the way that only things with purpose watch. It had been there since midnight. Ranger knew. He always knew. The following week moved at two speeds simultaneously: the visible speed of physical work and rebuilding, and the invisible speed of the thing that had been set in motion the night the floor opened. Cole drove to Billings the morning after the broken window and sat across from Claire Novak in her fourth-floor office for 4 hours, going through 11 years of Walt Briggs' documentation with the methodical attention it deserved. Claire Novak's office matched her serious, functional, organized for work rather than impression. She shook Cole's hand, looked at Ranger with the same recognition Walt had shown, and closed the office door without ceremony. Cole placed the USB drive on her desk. Claire looked at it for a moment without touching it. Then she looked at Cole. "Did you view any of it?" "No, Walt asked me not to." She nodded. "Walt called me 3 years ago. He told me he had documentation but wasn't ready to move on it. He was afraid, not for himself, but for what it would do to people in the valley who were already in difficult situations with Ridgeline. He didn't want to start something he couldn't finish." She picked up the drive. "He also told me that when the time came, he would know the right person to give it to." "He gave it to a man who owns a diner and has nowhere else to be," Cole said. "He gave it to a Navy SEAL who has nothing left to lose and no reason to walk away from a fight," Claire said evenly. "Those are not the same thing." She plugged the drive into her laptop. What was on it was 11 years of documentation organized with the methodical patience of a man who had spent 2 years in Korea learning that records were the difference between accountability and impunity. Spreadsheets cross-referencing property transactions along the Highway 12 corridor with dates, assessed values, and sale prices. Photographs of official notices, zoning complaints, code violations, water ordinance citations sent to property owners in the months before Ridgeline approached them with offers. Copies of county records showing sale prices that, when laid against independent assessments, told a story of systematic, deliberate undervaluation applied with the consistency of a plan rather than the randomness of coincidence. 17 properties documented, 14 sold to Ridgeline or affiliated holding companies at prices between 11 and 23% of assessed value. 3 had not sold. One of them is the diner. The survey map from 1962 became clear in context. Beneath the Highway 12 corridor running northeast to southwest for 11 miles sat one of the largest untapped natural gas deposits in the state of Montana, identified in preliminary geological surveys in the late 1990s and never made public record. The mineral rights to that corridor were attached to surface ownership. Every property Ridgeline had acquired came with mineral rights worth, at conservative estimates, based on current market data, between 40 and 60 times what Ridgeline had paid for the land. The diner sat directly above the center of the deposit. Cole sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, putting the pieces in their order. "Walt knew about the gas deposit?" he asked. "Walt found a geological survey report in 2003 that had been misfiled in county records," Claire said. "He was there doing routine title research on his own property. He made a copy and kept it without telling anyone. 2 years later, Ridgeline approached him for the first time." She paused. "He understood immediately what they were doing. And he didn't sell." "He didn't sell." Claire looked at the screen. "He also didn't go public because he didn't have the full picture yet, and because—" She stopped, choosing her next words carefully. "Because some of the county officials whose signatures appear on these documents were people he'd known for 20 years. He needed to be certain before he moved, because once he moved, there would be no second chance." "Who do we take it to?" Cole asked. "The FBI field office in Billings," Claire said. I have a contact there, a man named Garrett, who has had Ridgeline Peripheral on two separate investigations over the past 4 years and has never had enough to move on them. She looked at Cole steadily. But here's what you need to understand before we do that. Once we hand this over, you become a material witness. The diner becomes relevant to an active federal investigation. Ridgeline will know within 48 hours that the documentation exists and where it came from. She paused. They will not be subtle about their response. Cole thought about the hole in the window, about the concrete block on the floor, and the footprints in the snow heading toward the road, about the SUV parked in the dark 200 yards east. They're already not being subtle, he said. Before Cole left Claire's office that day, she mentioned one more thing almost as an aside, the way lawyers sometimes mention the important thing as though it were an afterthought, so that it lands without the weight of announcement. Walt mentioned something else to me 3 years ago, she said. He said there was more than one place he'd stored evidence, that if anything happened to him or to the main documentation, there was a secondary source. He didn't tell me where. She looked at Cole. He said the dog would find it if the time came. Cole looked at Ranger. Ranger looked back at him with his dark, steady eyes. On Cole's second full week of work in the barn behind the diner, sorting through old equipment in storage to assess what could be used and what needed to go, Ranger suddenly stopped in the middle of the space. He was in the far corner near a section of interior wall that had been paneled over at some point in the diner's history, the new boards slightly different in color from the old. Owen's the seam between them visible once you were looking for it. He stood there and pressed his nose to the wall. Then he began to scratch at the base of the paneling with the focused, insistent attention of his lockbox alert, not frantic, not uncertain. Certain. Cole crossed to him and crouched down. He ran his hands along the base of the wall panel. Near the floor, his fingers found a seam, a section of paneling that had been fitted independently, that was held in place by two screws that had been painted over but not filled. He took his utility knife and worked the screws loose. The panel section came away in one piece. Behind it, in a shallow space between the new paneling and the original wall, sat a cassette tape recorder in a protective nylon case sealed in a second layer of heavy plastic wrap. Beside it, a cassette tape labeled in Walt's handwriting, September 14th, 1989. Cole did not play the tape. He held it in his hands for a moment, feeling its weight. 35 years. Whatever was on it had been waiting 35 years behind a wall that a dog had found in a week. He sealed it carefully in his jacket pocket and called Claire Novak from the barn. "There's a second piece," he said when she answered. Silence on the line. "Then what kind of piece?" "A cassette recording. 1989. Another silence, longer this time. "Cole," her voice was very quiet, "bring it to me. Bring it directly to me. Don't play it. Don't let anyone know you have it." "Already on my way," Cole said. Part 3. The floor holds. The drive to Billings took 2 hours on roads that were still half frozen from the most recent storm. The highway cutting through country that looked in winter like a photograph of itself. Everything reduced to essential lines, color stripped away, only shape and distance remaining in the pale morning light. Cole drove with the heat on low, and Ranger in the back seat and the cassette tape in his jacket pocket close to his chest. He thought about the combination. 1953, the year Walt shipped out at 19 to a war that the country had already begun forgetting before it ended. A boy standing on a dock somewhere on the Pacific coast, looking at a ship that would carry him towards something he could not yet imagine. And coming back 2 years later, the kind of man who pressed record in a back room in 1989 because his instincts told him that what he was hearing needed to be preserved. 35 years of preservation, 35 years of patience. Cole wondered how many mornings Walt had opened the diner, made the coffee, wiped down the counter, and carried both of those hidden things in his chest alongside everything else. The lockbox under the floor, the tape behind the wall, knowing they were there waiting for the conditions that would make them useful. Claire Novak was already at her desk when Cole arrived. She took the cassette from him and held it the way you hold something fragile, not with fear of dropping it, but with the awareness of its irreplaceability. She had a portable cassette player in the bottom drawer of her desk. Cole had the brief, strange thought that she had been keeping it there for this specific purpose. She plugged it in. She looked at Cole. He nodded. She pressed play. The recording quality was what you expected from 1989 present, but rough voices, slightly compressed ambient sounds given equal weight with the words. There was the sound of a room, the scrape of chairs, the particular acoustic of a backroom space, and then voices. Three of them initially speaking with the unguarded directness of men who believe themselves completely unobserved. The first voice laid out a plan with the business-like clarity of someone who has thought it through completely and is now briefing others. The plan concerned the systematic acquisition of land along a specific corridor in Flathead and Cascade Counties land that sat above a geological formation of significant interest to natural gas extraction. The plan involved manufactured pressure on current owners' regulatory citations that would appear organic tax reassessments that would be difficult to challenge without resources, infrastructure interpretations that would create liability where none had previously existed. The plan involved payments to two county officials who would facilitate the regulatory side of the operation. The plan involved patience years, possibly decades, and the understanding that each acquisition would be completed before the next was begun to avoid the appearance of pattern. The second voice asked questions. The third voice provided numbers. And then near the end of the recording, after the plan had been laid out in its entirety, after the specific properties had been identified, after the timeline had been agreed upon, a fourth voice said something in response to a question about what to do if a property owner refused to sell regardless of pressure. The fourth voice was younger than the others, and it said with the particular flatness of someone who has already made peace with a decision before being asked to voice it. Then we make the cost of refusing higher than the cost of selling. There's always a threshold. The fourth voice belonged to Dale Voss. 35 years ago, Voss had been in that room, not as the architect of the plan, too young for that, as a junior participant, ambitious enough to understand what was being built and certain enough of its profitability to commit to it without visible hesitation. Claire stopped the tape. The office was very quiet. Outside, 2 floors down, a car horn sounded on the street below and then stopped. Ranger lay beside Cole's chair, one paw touching Cole's boot. How old would Voss have been in 1989? Cole asked. Claire was already doing the math. 22, 23 at most. Cole looked at the cassette player. He was planning this when he was 22 years old. He's been executing it for 35 years, Claire said. Vinon. With patience, she looked at Cole steadily. Walt was 19 years old when he walked into that room to deliver documents and set his bag down on the table and pressed record. Do you understand what that means? Cole understood exactly what it meant. It meant that on the same day in September 1989, a 22-year-old had committed to 35 years of fraud and a 19-year-old had committed to 35 years of evidence. Both of them patient, both of them certain, both of them waiting for the conditions that would make the thing they were doing matter. The difference was what they were doing it for. Cole called Agent Garrett that afternoon from Claire's office with Claire present. Garrett arrived the following morning, a quiet, methodical man in his 40s who had made a professional virtue of appearing unremarkable. He sat at Claire's conference table and listened to the cassette tape from beginning to end without changing his expression. When it finished, he was quiet for a moment. We've had Ridgeline adjacent on 3 separate investigations over the past 4 years, he said finally. Never had enough to move on them. The documentation on the drive was close. This tape, he paused. This tape is different. How long? Cole asked. Depends on how cooperative the county officials decide to be once they understand their options. Garrett looked at Cole. Walt Briggs was meticulous. He was a soldier, Cole said. Yes, Garrett said. I can see that. The investigation opened quietly. Cole was instructed to continue normal operations at the diner, maintain records of all contact with Ridgeline, and call Garrett's direct line if the situation escalated physically. Cole drove back to Harlow Creek and went back to work. 4 days later, a certified letter arrived at the diner. Ridgeline Group, represented by a Billings law firm, whose letterhead occupied the top quarter of the page in the manner of organizations that believe the appearance of gravity is itself a form of power, was challenging the validity of the deed transfer. Their argument was specific and prepared. It had clearly been drafted in advance, waiting for the right moment to deploy. Walter Briggs had been hospitalized within hours of signing the deed, suggesting he had been in medical distress at the time of signing and therefore not legally competent to execute a binding property transfer. They were seeking an emergency injunction to freeze the title pending a formal competency determination. Cole called Claire before he finished the first page. "I expected this," she said. "It's their only remaining legal avenue now that the FBI has opened the investigation. How long before the injunction hearing?" 10 days. "That's workable. I need Walt to provide a notarized statement specific about his mental state at the time of signing, witnessed by his attending physician. He's still in the hospital." "I know. Can he do it?" Cole thought about Walt with his crossword book and his strong opinions about hospital food and his barely disguised impatience with his own recovery schedule. "Yeah," he said, "he can do it." He drove to the hospital that afternoon with coffee and a thermos because Walt had described the hospital coffee as a moral failing, and Cole had found this assessment correct. He sat beside the bed and presented the letter clearly and completely without softening it. Walt listened without interrupting. When Cole finished, the old man was quiet for a moment, his hands folded on the blanket with the stillness of a man who is thinking rather than waiting. Then he said, "They waited until I was in a hospital bed. That's their move. They've always worked by finding where people are weak. Claire can fight it, but she needs a statement." Walt looked at him with his pale blue eyes and something in them that Cole recognized as the particular clarity of a man who has been waiting a very long time for a specific fight and has just been informed that the fight has arrived. "I was completely competent when I signed that deed, Cole. I had been planning to sign it for 6 months. I had consulted with Claire twice. The only thing that changed that evening was that my heart decided to register an inconvenient opinion about my schedule." He paused. "Get me the notary." The notary came the following morning. The statement was 4 paragraphs, unambiguous in every particular. Walter James Briggs, in full possession of his cognitive faculties, had made the decision to transfer his property weeks prior to the signing date, had consulted with legal counsel on multiple occasions, and had executed the transfer with complete understanding of its terms and implications. His primary care physician reviewed the statement and added his own signed attestation confirming that Walt's cognitive function throughout his hospitalization had been unimpaired at all times. Claire filed the counter response the next day. The injunction was denied 48 hours later. Ridgeline's attorney called Cole's phone that evening, not Voss, but a different voice, colder and more direct, the voice of someone who has abandoned the warmth register entirely and is operating in pure function. "This isn't finished, Mr. Merritt." "No," Cole said. "It's just getting started." Walt walked through the door of the diner on a Thursday morning in February. He looked thinner than before. The hospital weeks had taken weight from him that he hadn't had to spare. He was moving carefully, one hand on the doorframe as he navigated the step, wearing his jacket over what were clearly still hospital-issue clothes. He had discharged himself against his doctor's recommendations, which his doctor had apparently predicted with professional accuracy, but he was standing upright. His pale blue eyes were clear and direct, and the expression on his face as he looked around the diner at the painted walls, the repaired window, the photograph gallery beside the register, the general quality of a place that has been cared for, was one that Cole had no exact word for, except that it was the face of a man seeing something he had hoped for, but had not permitted himself to fully believe was possible. Cole came around the counter and took Walt's arm without making a production of it. "They released you." I released myself, Walt said, which was technically accurate. The doctor has opinions about that too. He sat at the counter, the same stool where Cole had sat the first morning, and Cole poured 2 cups of coffee. Walt looked at the photograph wall for a long time, taking in the photographs one by one. His own photo. Korea, 1953. 19 years old in a uniform that looked 3 sizes too large. You did this, Walt said. Gary found the box of photos in the storage room. I just hung them up. Walt was quiet, drinking his coffee. Outside, Gary's pickup turned into the lot, then Frank's truck, then Torres in his work van, then Harold's battered Suburban. They came in and found Walt at the counter, and the greetings were brief and genuine, and nobody made more of it than it was, which was exactly the right amount. Danny Reeves arrived an hour later. He had been back 4 times since the first night, each visit slightly longer than the one before, each one carrying slightly less of the rigid, over-controlled stillness of his first appearance. He had begun helping with small repairs without being asked, holding things in place while Cole fastened them, fetching tools, learning the particular cadence of physical work as a way of being present without needing to explain yourself. Walt watched Danny for a while with the particular attention of a man watching something confirm a long-held belief. Then he turned to Cole and said quietly enough that only Cole could hear, "That's why I built this place." Cole looked at Danny Young-Thin, still carrying the specific weight of what he'd brought back from Afghanistan, and understood exactly what Walt meant. Not Danny specifically. The fact of Danny. The fact that someone in that condition could find their way through a diner door because of what the diner was, and sit in a booth for 3 hours because of what the diner allowed. I know, Cole said. The federal hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday in March at the United States District Court in Billings. Cole drove there in the same truck and with the same worn canvas jacket and Ranger in the back seat. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of morning that feels like something being said plainly. Claire met him in the parking lot with a case file that had suggested she had not slept adequately in several days and had negotiated with that fact rather than tried to change it. She said, "How are you?" she asked. "Ready," Cole said. It was the truest single word available. The courtroom was fuller than Cole had expected. The community of Harlow Creek and the surrounding valley had followed the case through the slow word-of-mouth channels that exist in small communities, not news coverage, which had been deliberately minimal, but the network of men and women who had watched Ridgeline operate in their valley for a decade and had not until now had a mechanism for response. They had come because they needed to be in the room where it happened, because witness was its own form of participation. Gary was there, Frank, Harold, Torres, and Jim. The families of 3 property owners who had sold under pressure and received a fraction of what their land was worth, who had come not knowing whether this hearing would restore anything but needing to see the evidence made visible in a formal space. The current county assessor who had cooperated with the FBI investigation after being presented with documentation of what had been done in his office's name. Walt was there. He sat in the gallery in the second row with the careful uprightness of a man who understands that his posture on a particular day is itself a form of testimony. He was wearing his good jacket. His pale blue eyes were steady and forward. Danny was in the back row in a clean shirt, his hands folded on his knees, his back straight against the bench. Ranger lay under the table at Cole's feet, one paw touching Cole's boot. Claire presented the evidence in ascending order of impact with the precision of someone who understood that a courtroom is a narrative space as much as a legal one, that the sequence in which information arrives shapes what it means when it lands. Property records first. Valuation disparities, the gap between what Ridgeline had paid and what independent assessments showed the properties were worth. The timeline of regulatory citations and their relationship to Ridgeline's subsequent approach letters. The geological survey and its connection to the mineral rights that had accompanied each acquisition. The financial analysis showing what those mineral rights were now worth. Then the USB documentation, 11 years of Walt Briggs building a record property by property, citation, by citation, transaction by transaction. And then Claire placed the cassette player on the evidence table. The courtroom was quiet while the tape played. The ambient sounds of a back room in 1989. The voices of men who believed themselves unobserved, the plan laid out with businesslike thoroughness. And then near the end, the young voice flat and certain saying, "There's always a threshold." Voss sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit and did not move for the full duration of the tape. When it ended, he was very still in the way that a man is still when every option he had prepared for has just been removed from the table simultaneously. The careful smile was gone. What was left in its place was something that had always been underneath it. Not fear exactly, but the expression of a man who has spent 35 years in a room he built and has just realized the room has no door. Cole was looking at Walt when the tape finished. Walt was sitting in the second row with his pale blue eyes closed, not in distress. In something that looked like relief, the specific relief of a long wait being set down of something carried for 35 years finally arriving at the place it was always meant to go. The courtroom held its silence for several seconds after the tape ended. Then Cole stood. He had not prepared remarks. He had thought about it and decided that preparation would produce something shaped for the occasion rather than for truth, and that truth was what this room deserved on this day. "I spent 12 years as a Navy SEAL," he said. "I went places most people will never see and did things I can't fully describe. I believed I was serving something real, something that meant the rules applied and that people who violated them would be held to account." He paused, looking at the gallery, at Walt sitting straight in the second row, at Gary and Frank and Harold, and the families who had lost something and come here anyway. "When I came back, I drove for 11 months trying to find evidence that what I believed was still true, that the thing I had spent 12 years protecting was actually there to be protected." He stopped for a moment. Ranger pressed his weight against Cole's leg beneath the table. "Walt Briggs spent 35 years building this case because he believed the same thing. He didn't have a government behind him. He didn't have a unit. He had a recorder and a filing system and a floor he was willing to bury the truth under until the right person came along to dig it up, and a wall he was willing to hide 35 years of evidence behind." He looked at the gallery one more time. "I'm that person. I didn't expect to be. I didn't plan to be. But I'm not going to apologize for it, and I'm not going to walk away from it." He sat down, Ranger's paw pressed against his boot. The ruling came 4 days later on a Sunday morning when Cole was behind the counter, refilling Gary's coffee, and the diner had the particular warmth of a place where people had decided to be rather than where they'd happened to end up. Claire called at 9:17. Cole listened to her read the key points without speaking, letting each item land in order. "All claims against the Briggs property dismissed. Deed transfer confirmed as valid and binding. Federal investigation into Ridgeline Group's land acquisition practices formally opened and Dale Voss named as primary subject. 2 county officials placed on administrative leave pending inquiry. 14 families and individuals who had sold under the documented pressure campaign given a legal pathway to pursue restitution claims." "Cole," Claire said when she finished reading, "you understand what you did." "Walt did it," Cole said, 35 years ago." "Walt started it," Claire said. "You finished it." Cole set the phone down and looked at the room. Gary was watching him from across the counter, coffee cup in both hands. Frank and Torres were in a booth saying nothing, waiting. Danny was stacking chairs from the morning setup, turning them right side up with the quiet efficiency he'd developed over weeks of learning the rhythms of the place. Ranger was in the corner by the fireplace, settled in his patch of winter light. "Good news?" Gary asked. "Good news," Cole said. Gary raised his coffee cup an inch. That was enough. Walt died on a Saturday morning in early April. He had gone back to the hospital 3 weeks after his unauthorized departure. His doctor had predicted this with the resigned accuracy of someone who had learned to calculate Walt's relationship to medical advice. He declined in the way that old men sometimes do when they have finished the thing they were staying to finish, not dramatically, not in crisis, but by gradual withdrawal. the systems of the body releasing their grip in the patient, unhurried sequence of a man who has made his peace and is ready for whatever comes after making your peace. Cole was there. He had driven to Billings the evening before and sat beside the bed through the night in the chair beside the window, where the early light would come in when morning arrived. Walt was mostly sleeping by then, but he had been awake for close to an hour in the pre-dawn, clear-eyed and present, and they had talked in the particular way of men who are running out of time and have therefore stopped wasting any of it. Walt asked about the diner. Cole told him about the repaired roof and the new kitchen wiring and the photograph wall and the number of veterans who came through the door now on a given morning, sometimes 10, sometimes 15, sometimes a man who had driven a long way and sat for 3 hours and went home slightly different from how he'd arrived. Walt listened with his eyes closed in a small, specific expression that Cole would spend a long time afterward trying to describe and finally settle on as the look of a man whose investment had paid off beyond what the original calculation had suggested was possible. Danny, Walt asked. He's staying, Cole said. He asked me last week if he could manage the place part-time while he figures out the next thing. He's good with people. He knows how to sit with them without requiring anything from them. Walt was quiet for a moment. That's why I built it, he said. The same words he had said before, but weighted differently now. Not the observation of a man watching something confirm his belief, but the statement of a man summarizing the meaning of a large portion of his life in the simplest available terms. He said them like a man closing an equation he had been working on for 60 years. Cole sat with him until the morning light came fully through the window, filling the room with the thin, clear light of an April morning in Montana, and Walt's breathing had changed into the slow, deep pattern of something releasing rather than resting. He drove back to Harlow Creek in the afternoon. The valley was beginning to show the first real suggestions of spring, not warmth exactly, not yet, but a softening of the light, a slight drawing back of the cold, the first pale green appearing at the margins of things. He pulled into the diner's parking lot and sat in the truck with the engine off for several minutes. He was not sure what he was feeling. Grief was part of it, but grief with other things layered beneath and around it. Gratitude, responsibility, the specific weight of being the person who carries something forward after the person who started it is gone. The feeling of having been handed something and understanding that the handling of it is now yours completely. Ranger put his chin on Cole's shoulder from the back seat. Cole put his hand up and gripped the dog's scruff. They sat there together for a while in the parked truck in the spring afternoon while the valley went on doing what valleys do. The third PTSD episode arrived without warning 3 days after Walt's funeral. Cole was standing behind the counter in the early evening when a car backfired on the highway, a sharp percussive report that traveled through the open door and hit him in the chest before his brain had a chance to classify it. The present dropped away. The counter under his hands was gone for a moment, replaced by something else, somewhere else. The specific texture of another surface, in another place, the sound resonating backward across years. He gripped the counter hard. Ranger was against him in 2 steps, his full weight pressing into Cole's legs, warm and solid and insistently present. Cole breathed. Once. Twice. The counter came back under his hands. The diner came back around him. The photographs on the wall. The warm light above the counter. Danny at the far end, washing cups, not looking over, giving Cole the privacy of being unobserved while being near. 2 breaths. 3. Here. He stood up straight. Ranger stayed pressed against him for another 10 seconds and then stepped back, watching Cole's face. Okay, Cole said quietly. Ranger held his gaze for a moment. Then he went back to his corner and lay down in his patch of firelight. Cole stood at the counter for a moment longer, feeling the residue of it moving through him and out the other side. Then he picked up the coffee pot and refilled Gary's cup and said nothing about it because nothing needed to be said. Gary looked at him and then looked at his coffee and took a sip, and that was enough. A week after Walt's funeral, Cole was clearing the old barn behind the diner in the afternoon. He was making room for what he was beginning to plan, an extension of some kind, a space where the growing number of veterans who came to the diner could be present for longer than a cup of coffee allowed. He had been thinking about it carefully, the way he thought about things that mattered not with urgency, but with the patient attention of a man who has learned that good plans require more preparation than brilliant ones. Ranger was working alongside him as always, conducting his own investigation of the space with the thoroughness that never quite turned off, moving along the walls and floor with the systematic attention of a dog who has learned that important things are sometimes hidden rather than obvious. At 4 in the afternoon, Ranger stopped. He was at the base of the old oak tree in the back corner of the property, the largest tree on the lot, with a trunk 3 feet across and roots that had been lifting the soil around their base for 100 years. He was pawing at the ground between two of the largest surface roots, with the focused, insistent certainty of his alert. Not frantic, not uncertain. The particular quality of a dog who has found something and is communicating that fact to the one person who needs to know it. Cole crossed to him and knelt down. Between the roots in a depression where the soil had been disturbed and resettled over what looked like many years, compressed and released and compressed again, through many cycles of freeze and thaw, his fingers found the edge of something metal. He cleared the soil, carefully pulling it away in small amounts, working with the patience of a man who understands that what he's uncovering is irreplaceable. A small tin box, the kind used for keepsakes or personal objects, the kind of box that appears at estate sales and antique markets and is purchased by people who understand that its value is in what it was used to hold rather than what it is made of. It was sealed with electrical tape that had dried and cracked and been replaced at least once, the overlapping layers, telling a story of someone returning to the spot over years, maintaining the seal, making sure the thing inside stayed protected. Cole opened it carefully. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had kept its contents dry, were two things. A service medal, not Walt's Korea medal, which was in the diner on the photograph wall. This was different, an older medal, World War II. The ribbon faded to near colorlessness, the metal dark with the patina of decades. The name on the back, engraved in small, deliberate letters, was not a name Cole recognized. R.H. And beneath the medal, a piece of paper folded 3 times, brittle with age. The handwriting on it faded but legible in the afternoon light when Cole tilted it toward the sun. To whoever finds this, I came back from the war in 1945, and I didn't know how to be in the world anymore. I had been somewhere that most people hadn't been, and I couldn't find a way to explain the distance it had put between me and everything that was supposed to be normal. I drove for weeks. I stopped at a diner on Highway 12 because I needed somewhere to sit that didn't require me to pretend to be something I wasn't. The man who ran it, I never knew his name, let me sit for 4 hours and refilled my coffee without asking a single question. I slept in my truck in his parking lot, and in the morning he brought me breakfast and wouldn't take my money. He just said, "Come back when you need to." I don't know where I would be without that morning. I drove home the next day, and I started figuring out how to live again. It took time, but I had something to build on, the knowledge that there were places where you could be what you were without explanation. I came back 15 years later to find the man and thank him, but the diner had changed hands and no one remembered who I was asking about. So I buried this here instead, so that whoever takes care of this place someday would know that what they are doing matters, that it has always mattered, that there were men before me who needed it, and there will be men after you. Keep the door open. Our age, 1960. Cole read it twice. Then he sat back on his heels in the thin April sunlight with the medal in one hand and the note in the other, and Ranger lay down beside him with his chin on Cole's knee, and Cole let the full weight of what he was holding settle into him without trying to manage it or contain it. Not just the medal, not just the words, the chain. A man in 1945 who needed somewhere to sit that didn't require him to pretend. A diner on Highway 12 that kept its door open. 15 years of that man carrying the memory of a morning that had mattered and coming back to find the diner had changed hands and the man was gone. And so this box buried between these roots, addressed to whoever came next, addressed across the decades to a specific category of person rather than a specific individual, trusting that the category would always exist. And a boy named Walt who came back from Korea and built that diner into something that gave the same gift across generations, who pressed record in a back room at 19 because his instincts told him that some things needed to be preserved, who buried 30 years of evidence under a floor and behind a wall, and waited with the patience of a man who had learned patience the hard way in snow and mud and temperatures that had no interest in human endurance. And Cole, who had driven 11 months looking for evidence that what he'd spent 12 years serving was real, who had pulled off a highway because a sign said hot coffee and there was nothing else to pull off for, who had sat at a counter and found an old man with pale blue eyes and a Korea service medal hidden in a lockbox, the thing he'd been driving toward without knowing what shape it had. The chain ran from 1945 through to this April afternoon. It would run forward from here through Danny Reeves and whoever came after Danny, and whoever they in turn held the door open for in the specific, quiet, unremarkable way that the door had always been held without announcement, without ceremony, simply by staying open. Cole carried the medal inside. He placed it on the photograph wall beside Walt's photo. He found a piece of card and wrote on it, RH 1945. He needed somewhere to sit. That was enough. The years were the point. The range of time that a man had lived and been given a morning he needed and had been grateful for, and had tried 15 years later to go back and thank someone for the years told the story more honestly than any more elaborate notation could. He stood back and looked at the wall. Walt at 19 in Korea. RH's medal without a face attaches to it. The men from Vietnam and the Gulf and Afghanistan and Iraq, their photographs spanning 60 years of American military service. The unbroken line of men who had needed a place that understood them and found one here on a stretch of Highway 12 in a valley in Montana that most people drove past without stopping. The diner was full that evening. Gary and Frank had brought two new faces, veterans from a neighboring valley who had heard about the place through the network that didn't use phones. Harold was in his usual booth with Torres and Jim, the three of them working through something that involved a map of the property and pencil sketches of what an expansion might look like, because Harold had 20 years of construction experience and had decided without being asked that he was going to contribute it. Danny was behind the counter, moving with the easy efficiency of someone who has found a task that fits them, taking orders, refilling cups, greeting people with the particular quiet attention of someone who understood what it meant to be greeted rather than processed. Cole stood in the middle of the floor and looked at all of it. He thought about Walt's letter. You've been trained to carry weight that would break other men. That's not nothing. That's everything. He thought about the note from RH 1960. Keep the door open. He thought about the parking lot in Virginia Beach 11 months ago. The duffel bag, the dog, the complete blankness of what came next. He thought about 11 months of highway and cheap motels and the particular static of a man who has lost his structure and doesn't know yet what will replace it. He thought about a hand-painted sign on a fence post at a slight angle, Briggs Diner, open, hot coffee. He thought about a dollar bill that had been in his pocket since Wyoming. He thought about what it meant to be the next person in a chain that started before you were born and would continue after you were gone, not as burden, but as privilege. The privilege of being the person who holds the door open for someone who needs to come in out of the cold. The diner had a name now painted above the door in clean white letters that Gary had done 2 weeks ago with the careful, deliberate hand of a man who took the permanence of signage seriously. Waltz. A second chance diner, and below it, smaller, transferred from the sign Walt had kept behind the counter for the entirety of the 60 years he had run the place, established 1964. Still here. Cole walked to the door at the end of the evening and stood there for a moment with his hand on the frame. The diner was warm behind him, the warmth of a kitchen that had been running all day, of people who had been in the space and left their warmth in it, the specific ambient warmth of a place where something necessary had been happening for a long time. Ranger came to stand beside him, the way he had stood beside him in 4 countries across 12 years, close enough to feel never underfoot, present without demand, alert without anxiety. His ears moved in the evening air, reading whatever was out there, still working the way good soldiers continue working long after the official mission has ended, because the work has become part of who they are. Outside, the valley was settling into its spring evening. The cold was different now. The cold of a season releasing, rather than holding the cold of ground beginning to move again after months of stillness. Stars were appearing in the darkening sky in the so sequential way they always do. First one barely visible, then two, then a handful, then all at once, the full count of them, every single one that was always there visible now, only because the light had shifted enough to let them be seen. Cole thought about a man in 1945 who had needed somewhere to sit. He thought about the door of this diner being open for him in 1945, when the diner had a different name and a different owner, and the world was a different shape than it was now. But the door was open and the coffee was hot, and the man behind the counter didn't ask questions. He thought about what it meant that the door had been open every day since, through Korea, in Vietnam, in the Gulf, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Through generations of men who came back carrying things that didn't fit in the world they'd returned to, who needed somewhere that didn't require them to pretend those things weren't there. Through all the years of the diner's life, under every name it had ever worn, the door had been open. He thought about R.H. Coming back 15 years later to thank someone and finding the diner changed and the man gone, and choosing in the face of that impossibility to bury a medal between tree roots and address a note to whoever came next, trusting that whoever came next would understand what they were being asked to continue. Walt had understood. Cole understood. "Okay," Cole said quietly. Not to Ranger specifically, though Ranger was there. Not to the room behind him, though it was full of exactly the kind of people and the kind of warmth it had been built to hold. To whatever had arranged the particular sequence of events that had led from a parking lot in Virginia Beach to this door frame in Montana. The timing, the hum, the warped weight floorboard, the dollar bill from Wyoming, the hand-painted sign on the fence post at a slight angle. To all of it, he stepped outside. The night air was cold and clean against his face. He locked the door behind him and stood in the parking lot for a moment. The sign above the door was dark now, but he knew what it said. Ranger stood beside him, breath rising in slow, small clouds. He lifted his nose to the evening air and read it with the systematic thoroughness he brought to everything, the patient, comprehensive attention of a dog who has learned that the most important things are sometimes carried on the wind rather than hidden under floors. Some missions don't end when the uniform comes off. Some of them were waiting for you all along, hiding under a rotting floorboard, guarded by a dog who always knew where to look, addressed to whoever had the patience to hold still long enough to be found. Ranger turned his head and looked at Cole with his dark, steady eyes. The eyes of a soldier who has finished one mission and is already quietly beginning the next one. Then he looked back out at the road, still watching, still working, still here.